Let's talk more about this with my panel. The police shooting again of 43-year-old Keith Scott on Tuesday. Joining me now, Tom Fuentes, senior law enforcement analyst and former FBI assistant director. Laura Coates is also back with us, a legal analyst, a former federal prosecutor, and a former assistant U.S. attorney with the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. And Cheryl Dorsey is back with us. She's a retired sergeant with the Los Angeles Police Department. Cheryl Dorsey, to you, why the decision in your mind to not release all of the videos from your experience in law enforcement? Would there be any reason not to put it out there and sort of have what is really a partial dissemination of fact?
Well, I believe that there's something on that video that may be unsettling, not only to the community, but possibly to the family if they were to see it in its entirety. And so, the more we hear about this, the more questions there are to be answered. And at this point, I think that police department is almost in a lose-lose situation, because whatever they produce at this point is going to be suspect. People are going to believe that maybe it's been doctored. And so when...
Well, Cheryl, let me just stop you there. Why do you have cause to believe that there is something on that video that it sounds like you're saying the police wouldn't want the public to see? Because frankly, at some point, the public's going to see all these videos, because he said they'll release them all at the end of the investigation. And that journalists will be filing Freedom of Information Act requests to put it all out there. So what causes you to believe that there is something that they don't want the public to see?
Well, because there's unrest, and certainly we don't want to see any more destruction or damage done. And I think that what's going to happen, and he's kind of preparing us for this, because he says the video is not definitive. The video is not going to answer the questions that everybody is begging to be answered. And so we're going to be left at the end of the day with the same questions whenever it's released that we had at the very onset of this thing. And this police department will do what every police department does. They will throw buckets of money at the family. There'll be no substantive change in the way their officers do business. And then this will go on until we have the next Keith Scott or Philando Castile or Sandra Bland. That's why everybody is so frustrated.
Political commentator Mark Lamont Hill is also joining us. And Mark, I think it's really important to have this discussion in the broader context of race relations across the United States and race relations in North Carolina, because these protesters are protesting the death of this man, yes. They're also protesting, as we heard from the head of the NAACP today, the broader issue, and what she called, the head of the Charlotte NAACP called, this systemic problem within North Carolina for African Americans.
That's exactly right. Obviously, we want to get to the bottom of this case and find out whether or not something unjust has happened. And the delays and the lack of transparency is itself a problem. And it creates the sense that there could be something here. It creates a sense of distrust between the community and the law enforcement agencies. But it also speaks to a broader problem, as you pointed out, Poppy, that people are saying, which is that there is a question about whether or not black bodies themselves are inherently violent in the minds of some law enforcement officers. This is the problem, so that when a black person is walking down the street with or without a gun, they are seen as deserving of lethal force. That's an issue in Charlotte. That's an issue around the country that we keep saying replay over and over and over again. And the questions we have about violence against black bodies, male and female, is something that plays out in other sectors of our lives. As long as we see black people as not fully human, then it makes it difficult for them to have full access, not just in terms of being treated safely and properly with dignity by law enforcement, but also in the job realm, in terms of housing, in terms of education. We have to get to the deeper issues of racism and indeed white supremacy here.
So one of the things that is different, obviously the cases are completely different, but when you look back to Ferguson, for example, and you look at what has transpired since then, the police chief here is black, Mark Lamont Hill, and that is something that has not been broadly discussed. Is that, does that matter in all of this as people are looking at this from through the lens of race?
It shouldn't matter. There's a question here about how black bodies are treated by law enforcement. If black people happen to be agents of those institutions, if they even happen to be leaders of those institutions, look at Sheriff Clark in Milwaukee. You can have the same mentality as the most vicious white supremacists. In fact, you are a white supremacist at the level of how you perform if you believe that black bodies are inferior and worthy of lethal force. So I'm not interested in the officer being black. I'm not interested in the police chief being black. I'm not even interested in the president being black if justice doesn't look equal for everybody. We didn't march and fight and struggle to get beaten by black officers. We did it so that everyone would have an equal shot at being treated with dignity and treated like a human being.
Laura, from a legal perspective, is there any legal ground that the city of Charlotte has to stand on to not put all of the videos out there? Obviously, come October 1st, when the law is enacted that allows them not to release this video to the public, that's one thing. But this is prior to that. What legal ground are they standing on to keep a lot of this video to themselves?
Well, they're standing on the ground of precedence, how they actually have operated up till now. They have treated police videos and dash cam and body cam videos as part of a personnel file that's treated like a medical record or treated like a complaint against an officer or an otherwise private employment-related HR file. And the reason why this is problematic is because, of course, these are part of a public investigation into a death, and so they would be released as a record in terms of evidence in a court of law. And so to hold it as a personnel record is why they have been able to last this long. But remember, this October 1st law is a way of standardizing how these are actually going to be distributed and leaving it to the purview or discretion of a judge. But again, these videos, which is so surprising, are not being released in totality for the reasons that the chief has said. That's kind of unbeknownst to everyone. But he did. If I make one concession for the chief, I've been critical of him, but I will give him one particular concession here, and that is he mentioned at his press conference that the reason he didn't want to show the what he called pertinent information was because the people who were executing the search warrant were part of a squad that was going to be charged with, and they were undercover in some capacity or may have a security issue of being fully exposed. That was his recall of why this may be a reason not to do it. So perhaps that is one of his bases for his decision, and if that's it, a judge would probably not be willing to release that part of the footage.
I think that's a really important point and to make and that we haven't broadly discussed since the press conference. So I'm glad you made it, Laura. Thank you. Tom, if you had the ear of the Charlotte Police Chief, Chief Kirkputney, right now, what's the number one thing you would tell him to do?
Well, I would say try to find out technically what's the problem here. They've already agreed to put that video out. Why isn't it out? They've been talking about this all day. Are they having technical problems? Do they need some assistance in figuring it out, how to get that out on the internet so that people can access it? So that would be one of the first things. And I think the second thing, to Laura's point, that might be true that these other videos show officers that are undercover and you don't want their identities known, but he didn't refer to that as a reason. He said, well, they're not really part of all this. So if that's true, and if they're not sensitive from a protecting the officer's identity standpoint, they should have been released first, not last. So I think the problem now is that no matter what he says, it's going to be questioned.
Tom Fuentes, thank you very much. Cheryl Dorsey, Mark Lamont Hill, Laura Coates, stand by. We have a lot more ahead. Again, we're awaiting that video to be released from the Charlotte Police Department at any moment. Also ahead this hour, the North Carolina Speaker of the House will join me live. Stay with us. You're in the CNN Newsroom.